Ever since I've started this channel, it has been no secret that I have this really weird obsession with bad decks, but I can honestly say out of every bad deck I've ever made for this channel, this one will definitely be the one that takes the cake, as I'll be introducing to you guys the Sky Severing Blade Transrotor deck profile for Cardfight Vanguard Overdress standard format. Now, if you guys don't know what this card is, I don't blame you. I didn't either, but it was a card that is been discovered by the Minerva Rising set. It has the ability to Soul Blast 6 and then releases very powerful skill when this ability is completed. Now, you would think that with the skill with Soul Blasting 6, it'd be something amazing and strong, and as I showcase throughout the entirety of this video, it is a very powerful skill. But the cost and requirements for the skill are the annoying part of this deck. I believe that whoever designed this card was trolling and did not think that anybody would ever pick up this deck. I truly believe that they just need to throw an idea in there, or maybe one day this card will get an errata. That is what I am praying for, because otherwise, without any future support for this deck or this particular style of play, there is no way this deck will ever succeed in any sort of event, tournament, even locals. If you win with locals with this deck, I will honestly say that not even my say, I truly do believe either, respectively speaking, your locals is just filled with people who are just learning how to play the game, or they're filled with people who don't know how to read. But with all the jokes and the trolls and the unnecessary comments out of the way, we will finally go on over to camera 2 and check out this deck profile. Now wait a minute, before I head on over to camera 2, there is something that's been bugging me. I have noticed on my analytics lately that a lot of you guys who watch my content are not subscribed to the channel. That really does hurt my feelings, guys, but I get it, you're not messing with me, it's okay. But if the people that are messing with me and enjoy content like this, please make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Don't forget to hit that notification bell so you guys are always up to date on my newest content coming out. Maybe one day I'll post something you like. I'll drop that deck profile you've been asking for that I have not gotten to. I know I have a lot. I'm trying. But, you know, I'm trying. No, seriously, guys, finally. Let's hand over to camera 2 and talk about this deck. I'm actually pretty hyped for it. I think it's a fun deck that is a little bit all over the place, but something worth talking about. Okay, guys, so to get this very interesting deck profile started off with, I am showcasing to you the ride line that I am playing for Transrotor. The Diablos ride line is the freest ride line that we have in Dark States. It's the one that works with every single deck, and universally speaking, for this one, it works perfectly well. Steve giving you the soul charge while calling this back into the soul later with Richard means that we have a guaranteed grade 0 going into our soul. Also, the reason why I chose this ride line over like the Almagester ride line when building this deck is that the Almagester ride line, while you can potentially get a card draw, that card draw is not guaranteed unless you hit a critical trigger into the soul. So for that particular reason, going back into Richard to get our mat into soul, it was automatically guaranteed while getting a soul charge from this, means that we had a ride line that basically did everything I wanted it to, like the Almagester ride line I wanted to do, but it was automatically guaranteed. I wasn't about to risk not getting that extra card draw just to get one more card in soul with the Almagester ride line. This has been perfectly consistent so far, and unless we get a different ride line for Dark States, I think I'm going to stick with this one entirely for this deck build. Alright, here we go. So to showcase the grade 3 star of this deck, I am playing 3 copies of Sky Severing Demonic Blade Ultra Slaughter. Now, Ultra Slaughter's Soul Blast 6 ability to give 10k to everything is honestly incredible. The requirement for a Soul Blast of 6 grade 0s is the only thing that sucks about this, and I really don't know why they put this on here, but the 10k power is very welcome. In Overdress, shield values are very wacky, even though we have a lot of cards that gain shield, but this deck has no problem getting past a lot of high defensive numbers. Your 10,000 power bonus happens every single turn once you set up properly with your other cards, and it's not very hard to get a lot of units on board with this deck. Although you're not generating a lot of hand, you do have cards that can call stuff out, which means that you don't have a problem taking full advantage of this card. It just means that this deck is very glass cannon in terms of playstyle. The 10,000 power, it requires you to Soul Blast 6 grade 0, which means that's a lot of your defensive units gone. So blocking in the early game, as well as rushing your opponent hard in the early game, while generating huge amounts of soul for your skills, is this deck's winning image. Because you don't have a long lifespan with this deck, you are basically going for a really hard aggro game with the other ability, and you should try to win before they get their first persona ride off or when they go into their grade 2. Meaning that if you ride this first, that's when you should be trying to win the game if you can get the setup for that. I will say that with current support right now, getting the 6 card in Soul, you will always acquire that 8 out of 10 games. There are some times where you do have a lot of normal units in your hand, and unfortunately you just cannot reach that threshold, but that's perfectly okay because you're just playing a normal generic game at that point, and you can play slow if you want to, but you really want to push for the Vanguard with this deck as soon as possible. I definitely don't think that this card is completely garbage, but I do think that if they want this deck to have any chance of like just ever being played at all, they are going to need to give us some generic support that counts itself as grade 0, or grade 0 cards like other decks have in Dragon Empire that actually do something when they're called out in rearguard, or in this case Soul Blast out for the Vanguard's ability. For my next grade 3, we have 4 copies of Heat Haze Acrobat Miroslava. Now, Miroslava is super important for this deck because this is how we get units on board. Our Vanguard's ability gives us 6 units, 10,000 power, and we really want to take advantage of that as that's the only way this deck can win. So having her call something out from the Soul to rearguard is the main thing you're going to use this for. You also have the chance of getting your Persona Ride back if need be, but 9 times out of 10 you prefer to use this card to get something on the board to take fully advantage of your Vanguard skill. This deck is a glass cannon and again does not draw a lot of cards, so relying on the superior calling of this unit as well as replacing cards from the hand and soul to get stuff onto the board to take full advantage of our Vanguard skill. And Miroslava does that. And the great thing about this deck is because your Vanguard does not cost a CB, you are allowed to expel your Counterblast and other cards that will benefit this deck in terms of consistency and board management. And now for my grade 2s. So one of the pieces that I'm trying out for this deck is 2 copies of Esteemed Mage Ashur Da. Now, Esteemed Mage Ashur Da being able to put itself into the Soul after guarding with and getting 10,000 shield later in the game actually comes up a lot. So Transrotor Soul charges 6 cards after you do the Soul Blast to 6, which means getting the requirement for the 7 card Soul is not a difficult feat whatsoever. The 10,000 shield is something that is also very welcomed because since this deck does not generate a lot of cards, you're going to want to get as much shield value as you can from your other cards as soon as possible. You do see a lot of grade 0s in the early game because you do want to obviously put those grade 0s into your drop zone from the Soul as soon as possible, so you are blocking a lot in the early game. So later in the game when you're not seeing those zeros from deck as much because you've used the skill of your Vanguard to obviously Soul Blast them out, and at this point you're recycling from drop zone into Soul, cards that can gauge shield that are not triggers or have just high amounts of shield that aren't triggers are a big deal for this deck. I only played 2 of this one specifically because him putting himself back into the Soul means that we can call him out later with our Miroslava, and we have a 10k shield in play that is going to become a decent attacker on your Sky Blast turns. For my next grade 2, I am playing 3 copies of Steady Spiky. Now, Steady Spiky is one of those cards that I thought was going to be a 4 for this deck, but she's actually not. You really only use this ability to get out certain targets that you have in the deck for her effect of the trading a 0 from 1 to hand, and that's going to be cards that we'll showcase later, but she's also really another solid piece on getting grade 1s out from your Soul to start making sure that you can fill up your formation correctly. It's really a big deal that we try to protect our board with card effects as much as possible and get cards that we can any sort of way that is possible because again, we are not drawing a lot of cards. So our best targets for our Vanguard's ability is going to be in the Soul, and this card getting access to that is actually a pretty big deal. I just think that 4 of it is clunky because you have Miroslava already, and we do have other cards I feel are just more important in this deck to have right now to just make sure that we can even use our Vanguard's ability. And for my last grade 2, I'm playing 3 copies of Ultrasound Siri. Now, Ultrasound Siri is actually really important for this deck as this is one of the very few cards that you have in Dark States that let you pull cards out from your deck into the Soul and then also give you the draw. While this deck does fixate on grade 0s as that's part of your Vanguard's cost, you do Soul Charge 6 from his other ability, which means you're going to get random grades into the Soul. We also have a lot of skills in the deck that actually move cards from the drop zone into the Soul, and they don't all have to be grade 0, so the extra card draw as well as filtering the deck out for key grade 0 pieces actually does come up a lot. It's a good card to help get a neutral sort of gain while also being a target you can play in the early game to start thinning your deck out for those grade 0s and not feeling bad about it later once you go into your grade 3 Vanguard. This is how we can set up for our Vanguard as soon as possible to take advantage of the 10k bonus and finish our opponent off as quickly as we can. Moving on to the grade 1s, and this is where it gets a little bit interesting, I am playing 2 copies of Steam Scar Zargon. Now, Zargon has been making waves in every single Dark States deck, and for good reason. In this deck particularly, his ability to be an on-hit booster and get 2 cards from the drop zone into the soul clearly is to activate our Vanguard's ability. We need grade 0s in our soul as soon as possible, and having this card be another way we can get those cards in from the drop zone into the soul after the soul blast or an early game from discarding is actually a pretty big deal. It also means that we have targets for our Ultrasound Siri and Miroslava that we can pull out from our drop zone into the soul with this card, so everything that we have in the deck has a target. It also fills up the souls that are grade 2 Ashur Da will always be at the number it needs to be, and we can also put a copy of our Sky Severing Blade grade 3 into the soul to again fetch out with Miroslava, get grade 1 targets for our Steady Spiky, and so forth. It just does everything and makes sure that we have every wave managing our soul from everywhere in the field. For my next grade 1, I'm playing 2 copies of Friend of the Netherworld Ling. Ling serves the same purpose as Ultrasound Siri. She just gets to do the same thing a turn earlier and for less. Being able to filter your deck out for more grade 0s that you can put into the soul as quickly as possible is very welcome. She's another grade 1 target that you can search out with your Steady Spiky, which is important, and this is the most flexible slot in the deck. I just played 2 of these right now because I feel as though for this deck, consistency is more important than power, but out of all the cards you play, you can definitely swap this out for anything else. For my next grade 1 and the MVP of this deck, I am playing 4 copies of Inhale Pit. Now, Inhale Pit is the most consistent piece for this deck. For the Soul Blast of 1 of any card that is not a 0, you get to put 2 zeros from your drop zone into the soul. So this is obviously one of the key pieces you want to have on board as quickly as possible to start filtering those grade 1s and 2s out from the soul to get those grade 0s in as quickly as we can. It is probably the piece that you will make sure that you have access to always, as out of everything in the deck, I always want this on board as soon as possible to start getting those grade 0s in, and it does it a lot faster than your Zargon does or anything else that you have in the deck will, as this is an act ability that once every other turn you can take advantage of to make sure that you're always hitting the threshold with your grade 3 Vanguard's ability. For my next grade 1, it is 4 copies of the Recusal Hate Dragon. This is your typical D-Series Dark States PG. Now, this is where my deck differentiates from other Ultra Slaughter builds that I've seen, but I have decided to play 3 copies of Almagestar Pipis Mulchi for a Dark States grade 0. Now, as I've stated earlier in this deck profile, you really want to hit the threshold of your grade 0s as soon as possible. And while I could play other unit cards that can filter the deck out for more grade 0s, I actually felt that putting in normal grade 0 targets would help the deck a lot more, and honestly it has. It means that we get to save 3 trigger units in our deck because these cards will take the slot of that, and it means that we're also increasing the number of grade 0 cards we are playing in the deck from 17 to 20. So that means that we have a high chance of seeing these cards when using the effects of like Ling, Zargon, Inhale Pit, when we're using this card as an attack piece, a discard target, whatever we want to get out of it. I think that right now, this has been perfectly fine and works out perfectly well. It just means that your consistency with your Vanguard skill has gone up a lot. Although it is a starter and it does suck that I have to actually play this card, it's the only thing we can do to improve consistency for this deck as much as possible. I really don't think it's worth it to replace this card for another unit card that's essentially going to search out for another grade 0 piece when I can just play more grade 0 targets that my other skills already give me access to instead. But again, this is your choice of style of play. You can replace these cards with anything because they're just D-Series grade 0s. They don't have a purpose in this deck other than being a grade 0 target to activate for your Ultra Slaughter skill. And 9 times out of 10, you're just using them for discard fodder to hold on to your best cards in your hand that you can, so that finally when you go into your grade 3 turn or when you start rushing your opponent at grade 1 or 2, you don't have to get rid of key pieces like those, and you can just start putting these in the drop zone to be targeted with other card effects. Okay, so my trigger lineup is coming up next, and there's nothing wild about it. I'm playing 4 copies of Diablos Girl Ariana for my heals, 4 copies of Connected Rampage Glenn for one of my crits. I'm playing 4 copies of Esteemed Deviate Dragon as another set of crits, 3 copies of Rouse Wild Master Riley, and 1 copy of Galma Geld as the Dark States OT. Now, this trigger lineup isn't anything special. I feel as though with this deck, you just want to keep it as simple as possible. The 8 crits means that the attacks that are going up extremely high in power will become scary once you apply that critical bonus to it. The draw triggers, because again, this deck does not draw a lot of cards, so you really want to filter your deck out for the key pieces that you can. And then 4 copies of the Dark States Heal trigger Ariana, only because I feel as though you just want the guarantee that you're going to have as max shield value as possible. And I don't feel like in a deck like this, you really want to play around with your ratios of what's good in defense and what's not, because this deck already does not draw a lot of cards. So knowing that you have a solid 15 always accessible to you is extremely important. That concludes my Sky Severing Blade deck profile. Now, I know that the build for this is very interesting. There are a lot of odd card choices with this, but I know you guys want to really know how is this doing against the current meta or just on the casual level. I can actually say that this is a super glass cannon deck. So when you hit Persona Ride turns and you use the skills, you get your power-ups and you hit the crits from your drive checks, at least one or two if you haven't gotten all of them in your soul via vis-a-vis an effect, it actually feels pretty strong. You know, you are giving 10,000 everything on board, so it's like a pseudo Persona Ride turn, and then you get Persona Ride benefit, you're giving 10k to everything on board, then 10k to your front row. That's a lot of power going. It's just that unfortunately with this deck, it doesn't have multi-attack. The setup is really hard to get to because the cost requirement for the Vanguard's ability, which it's so dumb to me. I really do believe that if this card was just a Soul Blast 6, give everything 10k, this deck, in terms of its placement in the meta, while it might not be a top tier deck, it definitely would have been a playable deck, and right now I just don't feel that way until we get some sort of support that is a grade 0 support card that can obviously improve the consistency of this deck, so we're not playing the starter cards or the other odd cards you have seen within the build. But then again, you guys, I am very curious to hear your thoughts on my deck build. What sort of ideas or cards can I incorporate to make this deck better? This is definitely one of those decks where I won't be touching it for a very long time unless something interesting comes out, but I'm curious to hear you guys' thoughts and feelings about that and how we can move forward with it in the future. With that being said, card fighters, I will see you later. Peace.